97% of our exports to the countries in the TPP zone are already duty-free. So this is not so much a trade agreement as it's really an investor protection agreement. Inasmuch as 97% of Canadian exports to TPP countries are already duty-free, it's our view the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership is mostly an investor protection agreement, which should be primarily assessed on that basis. The arguments that this is about trade versus no trade and whether we're in favor of trade or not are sterile arguments in our view, and of course, Canada is a trading nation, and we need to continue to trade. That's not, in our submission, what these agreements are primarily about. The investment chapter of the proposed TPP includes the very controversial investor-to-state dispute settlement system, something we in Canada have considerable experience with since the advent of the NAFTA in 1994. This system permits foreign investors to sue elected national governments for policy or legislation which the investors argue may limit their potential future profits. It operates by means of secretive and unappealable commercial arbitration panels rather than the domestic court system that the rest of us must rely upon. Investor-state arbitrators are empowered to award monetary penalties against participating governments. ISDS provides extrajudicial protections to foreign investors that are enjoyed by neither domestic investors nor us regular citizens. It's a proposal to, as with the NAFTA, to provide protections outside of our court system for foreign investors. So the investor-state dispute settlement system that would be in place with the TPP would be expanded beyond North America to include all these Asia-Pacific countries, and we would see a situation where corporations based in Japan or based in Australia, based in Malaysia, based in Chile would be able to sue our elected governments in Canada for their public policies and their legislation, not in the court system that you and I have to rely on, but in an extrajudicial commercial arbitration panel, secretive, unappealable arbitration panels that are able to award monetary penalties against elected governments. So Canada is now the most sued developed country under ISDS. There have been 35 investor-state claims against Canada under NAFTA, and the number continues to grow. We've settled or lost 6 claims, paid out more than $200 million in taxpayers' money in penalties. So under NAFTA, Canada's already paid out over $200 million in these penalties, spent tens of millions of taxpayers' dollars defending itself against these suits. And so it's a mystery to me why Canada would want to take that experience and multiply it 9 times over and include all these other Asia-Pacific countries, the corporations from all those countries being able to sue us as well. I think that first of all, the investor-state provisions that we've talked about cause a policy chill for government. That governments that are at both the federal and provincial level that are worried that their public policy measures may result in a lawsuit from a foreign investor will start to change their policies. And we have a number, and not proceed with policies that they would like to proceed with. A famous example was the government of Ontario in the 1990s that had campaigned to implement public auto insurance of the form that we have in BC and in many provinces in the country, and they were told that if they did that they would be facing a NAFTA lawsuit from foreign insurance investors, and they decided not to implement public auto insurance. The evidence that we've seen so far is that the TPP would be damaging to the Canadian economy. The Tufts University report is the only one we have so far that's very thoroughly examined the question. Tufts University in Pennsylvania, and their conclusion was that the TPP will result in a net loss of 58,000 jobs in Canada and will increase income inequality in all of the TPP countries as wealth moves upwards to the 1%. And so that's exactly the opposite direction that we should be going. So I was calling on the Government of Canada here through the committee to undertake a very comprehensive and independent economic and environmental assessment social assessment of what the TPP is going to mean to the Canadian economy and the Canadian environment, because we don't have that kind of study yet. And so that it would seem would be a basic starting point for the government. So we recommend that the government proceed immediately to commission a comprehensive and independent public study of the likely economic, environmental, social, and community impacts of such a wide-ranging and potentially significant agreement.
The supporters of TPP, of course, say that they'll give them access to other countries.
Yes, but they haven't shown that the access is being denied now. Of course Canada is a trading nation. Of course we like to trade. So often in these discussions, it comes down to people saying, well, we like to trade or we don't like to trade. That's not really the argument. As I indicated, we have very few tariffs and duties for exports to these TPP countries now. There's been no serious identified problem with our trading with Japan or with Australia. We trade well with those countries now. So I don't see what the problem is that they're trying to solve with this arrangement.
But that's their claim.
That's their claim. That's their claim.
Increase their sales. Therefore, that will increase also employment here because they're selling more of our product.
Yes, but yes, that is the argument that they make. But I guess we need to look at our experience under NAFTA, where we've become much more dependent on raw resource exports, raw resource extraction and exports. Here in British Columbia, after NAFTA, we saw the collapse of the fish processing industry, where we were adding value to our fish resources. We saw the collapse of our garment manufacturing industry in this province, and through arrangements like the softwood lumber arrangement and others, we've seen an end to the traditional way that we did forestry in British Columbia, where if a company wanted a tree farm license and access to timber, they had to guarantee that they would build a mill and they would process the lumber in the local community. That's all gone now, and we've seen a rapidly increasing, ever-increasing export of raw logs out of this province. So if we want to be a country that exports raw logs, that exports gas and oil, that exports raw products, this is the way to do it. But if we want to be a country that's adding value, that's supporting innovators, that's getting involved in new technology, then we should be looking at those kinds of policies and not an ideologically motivated deal like the TPP. Agreements like this will very much advantage those corporations that wish to compete on the basis of cheap labor or lower standards. And we saw the experience with NAFTA of good quality manufacturing jobs going to a lower wage jurisdiction in Mexico from both the Canada and the United States, and then those companies leaving Mexico and moving to China and to Vietnam and other, competing on the basis of lower wages. And I don't think that's a basis that Canada can compete on successfully. And so I'm concerned about those aspects of the TPP. These countries have very limited labor protections and labor rights. So I think the other thing that this kind of a deal does is it makes us more dependent on raw resource export, raw resource extraction and export. Those are that's been the tendency in Canada since NAFTA, and I think that Canada will have to position itself as even more resource dependent if we go into this kind of an arrangement.
The free trade agreement in 1998 had a similar situation like today, and most people opposed it, but most politicians went along with it, the politicians that got elected. So a referendum in that case would have reversed that. So in this case, would you support the idea of having a referendum or requesting? They might not do it, but requesting for a referendum.
It's a good suggestion. I think that what a referendum would do, besides testing where the public's at, is that it would promote an intensive debate and discussion in the country, and that could only be healthy.
Do you think that the production of beef in Thailand or in Vietnam would be cheaper, and therefore, if we open trade, it will come and dump the market here with the cheap cattle from other countries? So you would be at a loss.
No, I don't foresee that being a big issue. The number one thing is they've got a much higher population. And the other thing is our population very much is determinant on quality. And the quality that we produce here through our grain-fed product, especially the barley-fed here in Western Canada, is paramount to what our Canadian consumer wants. There may be some that comes in to offset some of the ground product that we produce, but in some cases maybe that's a good thing where we get it at a little lower price to be able to satisfy our own consumers. So it's a matter of getting the right mix to do it. So.
Thank you.
We have a right to participate in the decisions that affect our daily lives, and yet have been entirely excluded from these negotiations. Over the past 4 years, Open Media has engaged over 130,000 Canadians who have shared their concerns with us on the intellectual property chapter and its serious implications for digital commerce, free expression online, and access to knowledge. I'd like to note that our work to educate Canadians about the TPP was no easy task, as the details of this agreement were kept secret until the full text was published less than 6 months ago. Our only means of information was reading the tea leaves of leaked documents and mining information from inside sources. From when the TPP was published on November the 5th, 2015, until it was signed on February the 5th, 2016, Canadian experts and the public had less than 90 days to assess the impacts of over 7,300 pages of this agreement. So I came here today to talk about the intellectual property chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is one of the largest and most contentious chapters, and it deals with everything from pharmaceutical rights to copyrights, all the way from A to Z. And it impacts people on a scale that we're talking about, your access to medicines, but also your ability to share and create culture online. And that's really one of the biggest issues that we've been raising over the past several years as we've been talking to our community is what's going to happen to Canadian culture and what's going to happen to the everyday internet use of Canadians as we see more restrictive regulations placed around what we can and cannot say online and what things will stay online and what things will go.
How is it going to make it harder?
Well, in particular, one of the issues that I spoke to today was the extension of copyright terms. So right now, Canada's copyright terms are life of the author or creator plus 50 years, so 50 years after the death of the person who created the thing. And what the TPP will actually do is extend that term until life of the author or creator plus 70 years. So basically 2 lifetimes. And all of this information that we have shows us that, in large part, most of the benefits of that copyright term extension go to really big companies like Sony and Universal, who own these copyrights that they've bought from individuals who own the right to reproduce or to share artwork that's made by others that are long dead. I'll be the first to admit that I've been unable to read the agreement in its entirety, and I suspect that none of the members of this committee have done so either. Today, I'd like to speak to just 2 issues in relation to the IP chapter, which I do have here. The first is what the TPP means for Canada's internet. If ratified, the TPP will bring 20-year copyright term extensions to Canada.
The harm to the general population would be that they have to pay for these copyrights?
They have to continue to pay more for things that should be in the public domain. So it really just narrows the scope of what we're allowed to use to speak to each other and to create more culture.
So the TPP is basically not a benefit for the majority of Canadians.
Well, it's certainly not a benefit for the majority of Canadians, and it's not even a benefit for the majority of Canadian companies. What we're actually seeing when we look at this is an agreement written by the U.S., for the U.S., and to benefit the U.S., and not the U.S. people even, but U.S. corporations.
What attempts did you take to get involved? Were you turned off? Were you turned away, said, no, you can't participate? Were you willing to sign a non-disclosure agreement so that you could actually be part of the process that a lot of organizations signed so they actually could see what went into the agreement and had input into what went into the agreement? Did you look at that, or were you involved in anything like that?
I think it's worth noting that 600 corporate lobbyists were allowed access to the full text and actually probably wrote many of the provisions that we now see in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But inviting people to a public hearing, while fantastic that we're actually taking this step, doesn't necessarily involve their input into drafting the agreement. And to your last question, we wouldn't sign a non-disclosure agreement because we do believe that Canadians have a right to know about what we're discussing and what kind of negotiations we're having. Right now, the government is involved in a process that lacks basic democratic legitimacy. I am honored to be one of only a handful of chosen witnesses from the 35 million Canadians who make up this country, but 5 minutes to speak to the egregious flaws in a 7,000-page agreement that took nearly 10 years to negotiate is not enough.
Do you think that the Canadian public should have a referendum on it?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to see a referendum on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I don't think it would go through. I think that what I'd rather see, to be honest with you, is our current government, live out the very, principles that they ran this election on, the transparency, the democracy, and really listen to what Canadians are saying. Because if you take a broad view of what Canadians are saying, the answer is unequivocally no.
We have the electronics ready for counting votes, not only on a petition, which is one-sided, but on a plebiscite, which is a non-binding,
Yes and no.
but you can count both sides. You
I think that would certainly be an interesting and worthwhile exercise to look into, even to just get a better sense of.
Do you want to see what the majority of
I would
people
love to
think?
know what the whole agreement will do for Canada, and that's why we really need an economic impact assessment as well. I mean, it's egregious that we've signed the TPP and we don't even know what it's going to do to our economy.
I'm an ecological economist, and as ecological economists, we're very concerned about, how do you make the economy and the environment work together so we don't degrade the basis for human well-being. And in looking at the TPP, I've been very much concerned that we're already in a situation where we're on the edge of dangerous climate change. The TPP is reducing the ability of states, as I see it, to actually put in effect effective laws, policies, and regulations to address the climate challenge. Because if they do, they could be sued by an investor. And that's just the wrong direction for where we need to be going.
The argument is that this is going to increase the GDP, and you mentioned something about that.
Yeah.
That greater economy is not necessarily well-being.
Yeah, just because we have more economic activity is not necessarily a good sign. I mean, it's the quality of the economic activity. Already the high level of GDP that we have now is associated with a planet that just can't sustain more of the same. And so, if the GDP goes up because we're all driving more polluting cars, the situation China faces now, where their GDP has been going up quite dramatically year after year, and the air in their cities is becoming unbreathable. GDP can also go up because you harvest the fish too quickly, or you cut down all your forests, or you mine unsustainably. So these are all big issues for us as ecological economists. GDP was never intended as an indicator of well-being. So why the big focus on how the trade agreement is going to affect the GDP or inflate it, those kind of things.
And based on past trade agreements, it has tied up the hands of the governments to put some ecological regulations?
Well, already Canada is facing disputes under existing free trade agreements. So when the government of Quebec put a fracking moratorium on the St. Lawrence, then Lone Pine went after them for lost compensation.
And Lone Pine is what the company
Like a company that wanted to extract oil and gas from the area. So there's a number of instances of this where companies have been going after governments. What does that do as the legislators sit around and think of new laws that they might be able to implement for the environment? They start to get scared. Oh, if we put in this strong law, we could be sued. And so that kind of regulatory chill is just the opposite of what we need. We need to protect our ability as a country, as citizens, to decide on the laws that are going to govern us. I'm just a Canadian citizen with a background in ecological economics, bringing that perspective to look at the trade agreement and say, wow, what I see doesn't look very good.
From the environment and economic point of view, it's not a benefit.
No, I don't think so. And when people talk about the economic benefits of this agreement, I think largely, often it seems to be inflated.
Would you call for a referendum? Somebody was yelling referendum in the crowd. Do you think that referendum would be a good step for the government to
No, I don't think what we need now is a referendum. I think we need the government of Canada to say, you know what, this agreement is not even worth discussing further. Let's let the citizens, what are their priorities? What kind of agreement the citizens in different countries agree to? I don't think it would be this next.
But how would the citizens give an input if it wasn't through a plebiscite or a referendum?
But a referendum just allows you to say yes or no to something. We need to have a much deeper conversation, right? We need to have a debate about what are our core values, what are we trying to do, what kind of work do we want in our communities, what protections do we want for workers who are in different countries.
But the liberal government is perhaps not going to listen to the will of the majority of the people. So are we going to let it happen because we don't want to hear through a plebiscite the voice of the majority of people? Are we going to let the few politicians make a decision, this specific decision?
You know, I'm maybe not the best person to speak about how we get Canadians involved and how we convince the government of Canada that we need a more democratic approach.
I'm here to represent the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and we are opposed to the ratification of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, otherwise known as TPP. We're against it mostly because of the investor-state dispute settlement clause that will override our rights as First Nations to protect our rights and title. Any claims by a foreign country will be heard by a 3-person tribunal in secret, and it's at an international level that overrides the domestic level here in Canada. I'm uncertain why we would want to, as a country, hand over powers from our domestic courts to the international level, but that's how it happens if another foreign state places a complaint against Canada. We have not been consulted yet. We were part of the initial talks around the agreement, and we're opposed to it.
Would you recommend that the government of Canada run a referendum before they ratify it?
Well, that's one consideration. However, as you know, as First Nations and the holders of the land, we want to have more than that. We want the Government of Canada to sit down and to have consultation with us to explain the text, which is 6,000 pages long, how it will impact our rights and title.
What I hear from other interveners here is that it's good for business, and that the native groups, nations, are also bound to benefit from it.
Well, you know, there's been a lot of numbers and statistics thrown around here today. Where those numbers are based on, where they come from, we won't know as a country until it's too late, really. If this TPP is ratified, it will take, the economists are saying, within 5 years. These trade agreements are more about corporations making money and not considering. They're only considering their bottom line. They're not considering the people. All the people in this room here, they're pretty much supporting the opposition of the ratification of TPP.
That's right. So if the majority of the people in general are opposed to it, do you think that a referendum or a plebiscite would be appropriate?
Well, it all depends now, because the question then would become, has the Government of Canada done its job to educate the people across Canada about the TPP? Because there's a lot of people that don't know about it, and if you don't know about it, how can you make an informed decision?
Meanwhile, we're letting the politicians make the decision.
Well,
so it's either the politicians do it or we do it.
For now, they're making the decisions. However, if this trade agreement is ratified, it will bind their hands federally, provincially, municipally, and at First Nations levels from making decisions that are good for the people. The corporations will be making the decisions for us.
If we increase the monopoly rights that we give to pharmaceutical companies, that allows them to increase the price of drugs that they own the patents on. And that then filters down to an increase in healthcare costs, which in Canada ultimately is going to hurt all of us in our taxes.
That's right, and that is part of the TPP, is the TPP is stipulating that, in fact, patents are going to be protected?
Well, we already have a lot of patent protection, obviously, but there are a lot of tweaks done in the TPP. In particular, it usually takes a long time to get a patent granted from the time that you file. And one of the things the TPP does is that if it takes 4 years to get that patent granted, then you get an additional 4 years of patent protection at the end of that time. That's a worry, because that's 4 years that otherwise other pharmaceutical companies could be producing generics that would compete with that and push the price of the drugs down. I feel that the length of time that the pharmaceutical companies have now that they get that monopoly is plenty long enough. They're making lots of money. It's obviously not something where they're borderline not profitable because of their lack of protection.
So are you saying that TPP is actually protecting the rights of these corporations that have patents?
Oh, for sure. I mean, they were the ones who had the input to write it. They had access to the negotiators, they had access to the texts early on. We get to see the final result, but they got to see it all the way along, and they got to provide input as to what things they wanted to have in there, and feedback on what the other countries were proposing as well.
So you're saying that TPP is basically the benefits of the corporations that are printed on the contract?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it benefits the people who had the input, who were able to say, this is what we'd like to see in it.
All right.
They may not have got everything that they want, but there are absolutely, most of the benefits are there for them. And the Canadian people never got the chance to say, this is what I'd like to see in the TPP.
Do you think the majority of Canadians oppose the TPP?
I don't think I can speak for the majority of Canadians.
Just a gut feeling.
I mean, I think there's a lot of stuff to be concerned about. There's a lot of stuff Canadians should be concerned about. And there's a lot of stuff that we haven't really been given the information about. They haven't done the government hasn't done a proper analysis of what impacts it would have on our economy as a whole. There's various little bits of analysis here and there on what effects certain chapters would have and things like that, but there's no sort of way of taking that all together and saying, is this a good thing or a bad thing for Canada as a country?
Will you ask the government to have a referendum on it?
That's a good question. I think we've certainly got a lack of democratic process in the TPP, and a referendum couldn't hurt. It is an expensive option. I don't know that it would be my preferred option. If the government says we're going to do a referendum, I would absolutely say, yes, great, let's go for it.
Would it be worth, even if it's a couple of $1 million, would it be worth more than going into the road of the TPP, which is going to probably cost us a lot more?
Well, I mean, one of the things with the TPP is if we do ratify it, then we're locked into that for an awful long time. It's very difficult to get out of these trade agreements. In fact, I can't think of an example where we've withdrawn from one of these trade agreements. And there's usually lots of restrictions on how you can do that and when you can do that.
So the cost of a referendum would be justified for such an agreement?
It seems that way to me, yes.
So
I'm not going to be writing the check, though.
Well, we are as a taxpayer.
Well, I guess so.